The air inside the St. Jude's Cathedral was thick with the suffocating scent of 10,000 imported white lilies and the hushed, judgmental whispers of the city's elite. It was the wedding of the century, the union of the billionaire sterling heir and the socialite darling Isabella Thorne. But for Sophie Bennet, it was a marathon of invisibility. Sophie stood near a fluted marble pillar, her hands clasped tightly around a simple clutch. While her sister Isabella was a vision of explosive lace and a 5-foot train, Sophie wore a dress of understated dove-gray silk. It had no crystals, no lace, and a neckline that bordered on monastic. It was the dress of a woman who had spent 24 years being the sensible background to her sister's technicolor life. To the sea of vultures in tuxedos and fascinators, she was nothing more than a part of the architecture. "Stay to the left during the reception, Sophie," her mother had hissed earlier, adjusting Isabella's diamond tiara with trembling, reverent fingers. "We don't want you cluttering the wide shots. This day is about perfection." Sophie felt the familiar dull ache in her chest, the quiet acceptance of being the clutter in her own family's masterpiece. She looked down at her simple hem, feeling the weight of 1,000 moments where she had been the shadow. She reached out to touch the cold stone of the pillar, her only goal to make it through the next 6 hours without a panic attack or a condescending comment from her father. But as the organ began to swell with the first thunderous notes of the processional, a sensation like a physical touch brushed against the back of her neck. Sophie looked up, her gaze drifting past the altar, past the priest, and landing directly on the man standing at the groom's right hand. Julian Vane. The best man. The ice king of the venture capital world. A man whose standards for beauty and business were rumored to be so impossibly high that no woman had ever lasted more than a single season by his side. He was supposed to be looking at the bride. He was supposed to be checking the ring. Instead, Julian Vane was staring directly at the girl in the gray dress. His eyes, a piercing, predatory blue, didn't just see her. They seemed to dismantle her. While the rest of the room gasped at Isabella's grand entrance, Julian didn't even blink. His focus remained locked on Sophie, his expression unreadable, intense, and utterly terrifying. Sophie's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked away, her face flushing a deep, traitorous crimson, but she could still feel him. It was a heat, a magnetic pull that defied the cold stone of the cathedral. "Why is he looking at me?" she wondered, her breath hitching. "I'm the shadow. I'm the one nobody sees." But as the ceremony began, Sophie realized with a jolt of pure adrenaline that for the first time in her life, she wasn't invisible. And the man who had found her was the most dangerous man in the room. Hello to all my amazing viewers tuning in from every corner of the world. Whether you're watching from a cozy room in Tokyo, a busy street in Lagos, or right here in the heart of the city, I am so thrilled to have you with us for this emotional journey. How are you all doing today? I hope you're ready to see what happens when the most overlooked girl in the room captures the heart of the most powerful man. Before we find out why Julian Vane can't take his eyes off Sophie, please take a quick second to check if you've subscribed to the channel. Your support means the world to me and helps us keep creating these 40-minute stories just for you. Hit that button, join the family, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The I-do's were exchanged, the cheers erupted, and the crowd began to flow toward the exit, but Sophie felt rooted to the spot. As Julian turned to follow the groom, he paused. Just for a microsecond. He looked back over his shoulder, his gaze finding Sophie through the crowd of hundreds, and gave a single slow nod of his head. It wasn't a greeting. It was a claim. Who was this woman in the simple dress, and why did she look like the only real thing in a room full of ghosts? The reception at the Fairmont Ballroom was a sensory overload of gold-leafed centerpieces and the sharp, rhythmic clinking of crystal. Sophie moved through the crowd like a ghost, her gray silk dress acting as a camouflage against the vibrant emeralds and deep magentas of the other guests. She had one mission: navigate the next 4 hours without drawing the ire of her sister or the disappointment of her father. Sophie Bennet had spent her life as the practical daughter. While Isabella was the masterpiece, Sophie was the frame, necessary but ignored. Her deepest desire wasn't for fame or a diamond tiara. It was for a single moment where she wasn't compared and found wanting. She was a botanical illustrator, a woman who found beauty in the intricate veins of a leaf or the subtle gradient of a petal, details the rest of the world stepped on. "Sophie, there you are," her father, Robert Bennet, barked as he caught her by the arm. He didn't look at her face, He looked at her dress with a grimace. Why aren't you mingling with the Holloway heirs? I didn't pay for that education for you to hide behind the topiary. You're a Bennett. Try to look like you belong here. I'm just heading to the terrace, Dad, Sophie whispered, her throat tightening. It's a bit loud in here. It's a wedding, not a library, he snapped, already turning his back to greet a senator. Sophie retreated, her heart heavy. She knew she was a disappointment to him, the daughter who preferred dirt under her fingernails to the polish of a boardroom. She stepped toward the buffet, reaching for a glass of sparkling water, when a shadow fell over her. The water is vintage, a deep, cool voice murmured. But the champagne is actually worth the headache. Sophie froze. Standing beside her, leaning against the mahogany bar with an effortless grace that made the room seem to shrink, was Julian Vane. Up close he was even more intimidating. His features were carved from granite, his eyes a blue so pale they were almost silver. He was a man who moved with the quiet, lethal precision of a predator. I prefer to keep a clear head, Sophie said, her voice barely a breath. She forced herself to look at him, her pulse leaping. Mr. Vane. You know who I am, he noted, his gaze traveling slowly from the simple hem of her dress to the stray dark curl that had escaped her bun. He didn't look at her with the pity she usually saw in men's eyes. He looked at her with an intense, surgical curiosity. Everyone knows the Ice King, she replied, a sudden, unexpected spark of defiance lighting up her brown eyes. The man who values efficiency over emotion. A ghost of a smile touched Julian's lips, a rare, dangerous sight. Efficiency is just another word for not wasting time on things that don't matter. The schedule. Watch me, Julian murmured. He leaned down, his lips ghosting against Sophie's ear. Shall we go, Sophie? Or do you want to stay and hold the flowers? For the first time in 24 years, Sophie didn't look at her father for permission. She didn't look at Isabella for approval. She looked at Julian and she saw a future where she wasn't invisible anymore. Let's go, she whispered. As they walked past her stunned family, Julian's hand stayed firmly on the small of her back. The inciting incident hadn't just been a meeting. It was a declaration of war against her invisibility. But as they reached the elevator, Sophie saw the look on her father's face. A look of calculating greed mixed with fury. She had been seen, yes. But being seen by the wolf meant the rest of the pack was going to start hunting. Julian just threw the wedding of the century into total chaos for Sophie. I am cheering so loud right now. But we all know the Bennett family isn't going to let this go easily. What do you think her father's next move is? Tell me in the comments. And if you're loving this, make sure you've subscribed so you don't miss the rising tension. The interior of Julian's sleek, obsidian black town car was a sanctuary of cool leather and the scent of expensive cedar wood. Outside, the flashbulbs of the paparazzi, tipped off by a discreet source at the wedding, smeared against the glass like dying stars. Sophie sat stiffly, her hands knotted in her lap, the gray silk of her dress shimmering under the streetlights. You didn't have to do that, she whispered, her voice cracking. You just ruined the wedding of the century, for a girl you met 3 hours ago. Julian didn't look at the road. He looked at her, his silhouette sharp against the city glow. I didn't ruin it, Sophie. I merely refused to participate in a stage play that had no heart. And as for the girl I met, I didn't meet a girl. I found a woman who was being buried alive by her own blood. He reached over, his large hand covering her smaller ones. The contact was electric, a grounding force that made the world stop spinning. Where do you go, Sophie? When the noise gets too loud and the masterpieces start to suffocate you. Where is the real Sophie Bennett? The botanical gardens, she said, the truth slipping out before she could censor it. In the old Victorian greenhouse. I go there to draw. Plants don't care about your pedigree. They just grow where there's light. Then that's where we're going, Julian commanded. But as the car glided toward the edge of the city, Sophie's phone began to vibrate incessantly in her clutch. It wasn't just a text, it was a barrage. Isabella, how could you? You've humiliated me. Every tabloid is saying the best man ditched the bride for the drab sister. Fix this, Sophie. No. Dad, Julian Vane is a shark, Sophie. If you play this right, the Vane merger could save the family firm. Don't be a fool. Bring him to brunch tomorrow or don't bother coming home. The rising tension wasn't just the attraction between her and the Ice King. It was the invisible strings of her family tightening around her throat. They didn't want her to be happy, they wanted her to be a bridge. Is everything all right? Julian asked, his eyes narrowing as he saw the ghost of a tear in her eye. They want me to use you, she said, her voice raw. My father. He sees you as a balance sheet. My sister sees you as an accessory she lost. They don't see us, Julian. They see an opportunity. Julian pulled the car to a sharp stop at the gates of the darkened gardens. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. Everyone wants to use me, Sophie. That's the price of the life I lead. But here's the difference. I let them because it's a game I've already won. But with you, I don't want a merger. I want the girl who wears gray silk like it's a suit of armor. He stepped out and opened her door, offering his hand. As they walked through the moonlit glass house, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and blooming orchids, the tension shifted. It was no longer about the wedding or the scandals. It was about the way Julian looked at her sketches, the raw, intricate drawings she kept hidden in her bag. You see the soul of things, he murmured, his fingers tracing the line of a sketched willow. Most people just see the wood. You see the movement. He moved closer, his chest nearly brushing her shoulder. The intimacy of the quiet greenhouse was 1,000 times more intense than the crowded ballroom. He was pursuing her, not with grand gestures, but with an attention so focused it felt like he was memorizing her soul. But just as he leaned down, his breath warm against her temple, a shadow moved near the entrance. A flash, distinct and unmistakable, shook the darkness. A red herring, Julian hissed, stepping in front of her. Someone followed us. It's not just someone, Sophie whispered, recognizing the figure retreating into the trees. It was her father's driver. He's tracking me. They won't let me have this, Julian. They'll turn this into a scandal that destroys your reputation before it even begins. The obstacles weren't just the paparazzi. They were the deep-seated fears that Sophie would always be a pawn in the Bennett family game. She looked at Julian, the man who saw her, and felt a crushing weight of hope and frustration. Maybe we should go back, she said, her heart breaking. Maybe they're right. I don't belong in your world. You don't belong in theirs, Julian countered, his grip on her arm firm. And I'm not letting you go back into the shadows. The family is already playing dirty. They're tracking Sophie like she's a fugitive just to force Julian into a business deal. My blood is boiling for her. Do you think Julian can protect her from her own father? Drop a Team Sophie in the comments if you're rooting for her. And make sure you're subscribed. The midpoint revelation is going to change everything. The damp, fragrant air of the greenhouse felt like it was thickening, turning from a sanctuary into a trap. The flash of the camera from the shadows had been a starting gun, and now the silence between Sophie and Julian was charged with a new, jagged electricity. They won't stop, Julian, Sophie whispered, her voice trembling as she looked at the dark glass of the greenhouse walls. My father doesn't do anything without a price tag. He didn't send that driver to protect me. He sent him to document a scandal he can use as leverage. Julian didn't look at the door. He looked at Sophie, his gaze intense, stripping away her defenses. Let him try. I've dismantled men more powerful than Robert Bennett before breakfast. But you're still trying to protect them. Why? Because they're all I have, she cried, the frustration finally boiling over. If I lose them, I'm just a girl in a gray dress with no place to go. I'm not like you, Julian. I don't have a kingdom to retreat to. Julian stepped into her space, his hands catching her shoulders. And yet, he stepped closer, the scent of sandalwood and rain enveloping her. I find myself standing here, wasting quite a bit of time wondering why the most interesting woman in this room is trying so hard to be part of the wallpaper. I'm not trying, Sophie said, her grip tightening on her glass. I don't fit the aesthetic. The aesthetic is a lie, Sophie, Julian said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate frequency that made her skin tingle. It's a loud, glittering distraction. You, on the other hand, are a study in contrast. You wear gray silk like a secret, and you have the eyes of someone who sees the world in high definition while everyone else is looking at the filter. Sophie felt a rush of heat. No one had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever looked past the sensible exterior to see the artist underneath. But as she opened her mouth to respond, Isabella swept over, her white lace rustling like a warning. Julian. There you are. Isabella chirped, sliding between them and placing a possessive hand on Julian's arm. She didn't even look at Sophie. The photographer is looking for the bridal party. You're the best man, you can't disappear to talk to? Well, to talk to the help. Sophie flinched. Isabella's casual cruelty was a familiar sting, but seeing it in front of Julian made it feel like a jagged wound. I was talking to your sister, Isabella, Julian said, his voice turning ice cold. He didn't move his arm, but he looked down at Isabella's hand as if it were an unpleasant insect. And I believe she was just about to tell me something important. He looked back at Sophie, his eyes searching hers, a silent invitation to stand her ground. But the years of being the shadow were too heavy. Sophie lowered her gaze, the old insecurities flooding back. It wasn't important, Sophie whispered, stepping back into the crowd. Excuse me. She fled toward the terrace, her heart shattering in her chest. She had seen the way Julian looked at her, like she was a masterpiece. But as she felt the cool night air hit her face, she realized the terrifying truth. Julian Vane saw her. And being seen by a man like him meant there was nowhere left to hide. Julian is the only one who truly sees Sophie's beauty, but her family is already trying to push her back into the dark. My heart is breaking for her. Have you ever felt like you were living in someone else's shadow? Tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one. And don't forget to subscribe so you can see how Julian pursues her in the next part. The terrace was a sanctuary of shadows and the scent of damp jasmine, a stark contrast to the suffocating gold leaf of the ballroom. Sophie leaned against the stone balustrade, her breath coming in jagged hitches. The cool night air felt like a physical hand against her heated skin, but it couldn't cool the frantic pulse in her throat. I'm just a background character, she whispered to the empty air, her fingers tracing the simple, unadorned silk of her skirt. I'm the gray sky before the firework. The sky is what everyone looks at when they're tired of the noise, Sophie. She jumped, nearly dropping her clutch. Julian Vane was standing in the archway, his tuxedo jacket unbuttoned, his silhouette cutting a sharp, lethal line against the light of the party behind him. He didn't approach like a guest. He approached like a man who had been tracking something rare. You should be inside, Sophie said, her voice trembling. The best man is supposed to be giving a toast. My sister. She doesn't like it when things don't go according to the itinerary. The itinerary is boring, Julian said, stopping just inches from her. He didn't look at the view of the city, he looked only at her. And your sister is currently occupied with a fountain of expensive chocolate and 3 photographers. She won't notice I'm gone. But I noticed you were gone the second you stepped through those doors. He reached out, his hand hovering near hers on the balustrade. He didn't touch her, but the heat radiating from him was a magnetic pull Sophie couldn't fight. Why me, Julian? She asked, the question bursting out of her with a raw, painful honesty. Look at this wedding. Look at the women in there. They are masterpieces of effort. They are diamonds and designer labels. I'm wearing a dress that cost less than the centerpieces. That's exactly why, Julian replied, his voice a low, resonant hum. I spend my life surrounded by effort, Sophie. I deal with people who curate their personalities like museum exhibits. But you have a quiet elegance that isn't for sale. You have a strength in your silence that makes all that noise inside seem small. Before she could respond, the heavy glass doors to the terrace swung open with a violent crash. Robert Bennett stepped out, his face flushed a deep, angry purple. Behind him, Isabella stood, her white veil fluttering like a wounded bird. Sophie, what is the meaning of this? Her father roared. He didn't see Julian at first, his eyes locked on his disappointing daughter. Your sister is about to cut the cake and you're out here mooning over the scenery? You're supposed to be holding her bouquet. Dad, I just needed a moment. You've had a lifetime of moments. Robert snapped, stepping toward her. You're an embarrassment. Look at you in that drab rag hiding away while your sister makes us proud. You can't even do one simple task. That's enough. The words weren't loud, but they cut through Robert's tirade like a guillotine. Julian stepped out of the shadows, his presence suddenly massive, his eyes turning into shards of blue ice. Robert froze, his mouth hanging open. Mr. Vane. I didn't realize you were. I apologize, I was just correcting my daughter's behavior. You weren't correcting her, Julian said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, silky whisper. You were insulting the most captivating woman in this building. And as for her drab rag, as you call it, it's the only thing in this entire circus that has any soul." Isabella let out a sharp, indignant gasp. "Julian, you can't be serious. She's just Sophie." Julian turned his gaze to the bride, and for the first time the Ice King let his coldness become a weapon. "Precisely. She is Sophie. And while you were busy making sure the lighting was right for your exit, she was the only one who noticed the caterer's daughter was crying in the hallway. She's the only one who hasn't asked me for a business favor tonight." He turned back to Sophie, reaching out and taking her hand. His skin was warm, his grip firm and possessive. "I won't be giving the toast, Robert," Julian said, not breaking eye contact with Sophie. "Because I'm taking your daughter to dinner. A real dinner. Away from this performance." The shock was a physical shockwave. Sophie's heart stopped, then restarted with a violent thud. Julian Vane, the most powerful man in the room, was choosing the shadow over the sun. He was forcing the world to look at her. "Julian, you can't." Isabella shrieked. The contact was firm, grounded, and suddenly deeply vulnerable. "You think I have a kingdom? Sophie, look at me." He pulled a small, worn leather wallet from his inner pocket, not his main one but a hidden one near his heart. He opened it to reveal a grainy, faded photograph of a woman standing in a small, dusty garden, her hands covered in soil, her smile wide and genuine. "That's my mother," Julian said, his voice losing its icy edge, replaced by a raw, hollow ache. "She wasn't a socialite. She was a schoolteacher who loved marigolds. My father's family, the Vane Empire, they treated her exactly the way the Bennets treat you. Like a smudge on a polished floor. They pressured her, sidelined her, and eventually they broke her heart until she just stopped trying." Sophie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The Ice King wasn't cold because he was heartless. He was cold because he was a fortress built to protect the memory of a woman the world had tried to erase. The revelation hit her like a physical weight. "You're not here because I'm a contrast to the party," she realized, her eyes searching his. "You're here because you recognize the look in my eyes. You've seen this movie before." "I'm here because I promised myself I would never let it happen again," Julian whispered. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "But there's something you don't know, Sophie. Something my father's lawyers have been trying to hide for years. The Vane merger your father is so desperate for? It's not because I'm expanding. It's because I'm liquidating. I'm systematically dismantling the Vane Empire to fund a foundation for independent artists and conservationists. Your father is trying to hitch his wagon to a star that I am intentionally putting out." The stakes surged to their highest point. If Sophie's father found out Julian was destroying the very wealth the Bennets were trying to steal, he wouldn't just be angry, he would be ruinous. He would destroy Sophie's reputation just to spite the man who had tricked him. "If you do this," Sophie breathed, her heart hammering, "they will hate you. They will turn the entire city against us." "Let them," Julian said, his face inches from hers. The shared vulnerability, the secret of his mother, and the truth of his mission created a bond that felt stronger than any family tie. "I've spent my life being the Ice King, so I could finally afford to be the man she wanted me to be. And that man, he wants you, Sophie. Not a merger. Not a headline. Just you." He leaned in, and this time there was no hesitation. The kiss was desperate and deep, a collision of two people who had spent their lives hiding in plain sight. It was passion, yes, but it was also a pact. But as they pulled apart, Sophie's phone screamed in her hand. A news alert popped up, the headline flashing in the dark. "Scandal at the Sterling wedding. Best man snatches hidden Bennett sister. Is it love or a hostile takeover?" Below the headline was the photo from the terrace. Julian holding her hand, looking at her with an expression that was unmistakably protective. The world had seen them. And the world was already twisting their truth into a weapon. The secret is out. Julian is tearing down his own empire, and Sophie's family is about to walk into a trap they set themselves. But the public scandal is already spiraling out of control. Do you think their new connection is strong enough to survive the media frenzy? I need to know your thoughts. Leave a comment and tell me if you think Julian is being brave or reckless. And don't forget to subscribe for the darkest hour. The cold blue light of the smartphone screen felt like a physical weight in the darkness of the greenhouse. Sophie stared at the headline, her heart sinking into her stomach. The image wasn't just a photo, it was a cage. It captured Julian's protective stance, but the caption twisted it into a calculated hostile takeover of the Bennett family's remaining influence. "They're turning you into a villain, Julian," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. "And they're making me look like a pawn you stole to get to my father's board." "Let them talk, Sophie. I've lived through worse," Julian said, his voice hard, but he didn't see the car pulling up to the garden gates. The headlights cut through the glass walls like searchlights in a prison yard. Before they could move, the heavy iron doors of the greenhouse were thrown open. Robert Bennett stepped in, followed closely by a weeping Isabella, still in her shredded wedding finery, and a man in a sharp gray suit, the family's lead counsel. "You've had your fun, Vane," Robert bellowed, his voice echoing off the glass. "But you've overplayed your hand. My daughter is a vulnerable young woman, and you've abducted her from a private event to manipulate a business merger. I have the photos. I have the witnesses. And I have a restraining order." "Dad, stop," Sophie cried, stepping in front of Julian. "He didn't abduct me. I came with him because I wanted to be anywhere but near you." Robert didn't even look at her. He looked past her at Julian, his eyes gleaming with a predatory greed. "Sophie is unwell. She's always been fragile. We're taking her home for her own safety. And as for the Vane-Bennett merger, you'll sign the original terms tomorrow morning, or I'll drag your Ice King reputation through every courthouse in this country for what you've done to my girls tonight." Julian's jaw tightened, his knuckles white as he held Sophie's hand. "You're using your own daughter as a bargaining chip, Robert. Even for you, this is pathetic." "It's called protecting the family asset," Robert countered. He signaled to two large men, hired security, who stepped forward from the shadows. "Sophie, move. No. Unless you want to see Mr. Vane arrested for trespassing and kidnapping." Sophie looked at Julian. She saw the flash of desperation in his eyes, the same look he must have seen in his mother's when the Vanes broke her. If she stayed, Julian would fight and they would destroy him. They would use his Ice King persona to paint him as a predator, and his foundation, his mother's legacy, would be buried in the scandal. "I'll go," Sophie whispered, the words feeling like glass in her throat. "Sophie, no." Julian stepped toward her, but the security guards moved to block him. "I have to, Julian," she said, her eyes filling with tears as she looked at him one last time. "If I stay, they'll break everything you've built. They'll make sure you never get to finish what your mother started." "Smart girl," Robert sneered, grabbing her arm with a grip that bruised. She always knew her place in the end. They dragged her away, the sound of her heels clicking on the stone floor a hollow mourning sound. Julian tried to follow, but the lawyer stepped in his path, waving a legal document like a shroud. "One step closer, Mr. Vane, and the police arrive. Is she worth your entire company?" Julian stood frozen in the center of the dark greenhouse, surrounded by the exotic plants that Sophie loved, feeling the crushing weight of a silence he had spent his life trying to escape. He had found the only person who truly saw him, and he had watched her walk back into the shadows to save him. Back at the Bennett mansion, Sophie was locked in her room. No phone, no internet, just the suffocating silence of the sensible daughter's quarters. Through the door, she could hear her father and Isabella laughing, popping a bottle of champagne as they toasted to the leverage they finally had over the Vane fortune. She sat on the edge of her bed, her gray silk dress wrinkled and stained with garden soil, feeling like the most invisible girl in the world. The situation was hopeless. She was a prisoner of her own blood, and the man she loved was a world away, trapped by the very empire he was trying to destroy. Everything is lost. Sophie is a prisoner, and Julian is powerless to reach her without destroying his life's work. "I am literally shaking right now. How could her father be so cruel? Do you think Sophie has a secret plan, or is this really the end for them? Tell me what you think in the comments. And please subscribe. We need all the hope we can get for the turning point." The moonlight filtered through the heavy velvet curtains of Sophie's childhood bedroom, casting long cage-like bars across the floor. She sat in the silence, her heart a hollow drum, until her gaze fell on her charcoal pencils and the sketchbook Julian had held with such reverence in the greenhouse. "Most people just see the wood. You see the movement," his voice echoed in her mind. A sudden, chilling clarity washed over her. Her father didn't just want a merger. He wanted to consume Julian's legacy to hide his own mounting debts. And Isabella didn't want the best man. She wanted to win a competition she had invented. Sophie realized that her invisibility wasn't a weakness. It was her greatest weapon. Because she was the only one who had been listening when the guests at the wedding whispered. She was the only one who had noticed the ledgers in her father's study while she was cleaning up his messes. She stood up, her jaw setting in a line of iron. She didn't need to be rescued. She needed to be heard. Sophie moved to her desk, tearing a page from her sketchbook. She didn't draw a flower this time. She mapped out the shell companies and offshore accounts she'd seen her father obsessing over for months. The true reason the Bennett fortune was a hollowed-out shell. "You think I'm fragile, Dad?" she whispered, her voice a low, dangerous hum. "Let's see how fragile the Bennett name is under a microscope." She didn't have a phone, but she had her window. She climbed out onto the trellis, the same one she'd used to sneak into the gardens as a child, and dropped into the damp grass below. She didn't head for the police. She headed for the one place she knew Julian would be, the old Victorian greenhouse. When she arrived, dazed and breathless, she found Julian sitting on the same stone bench where they had kissed. He looked defeated, his head in his hands, the Ice King, melted into a man of pure grief. "Julian," she breathed. He vaulted over the bench, gathering her into his arms as if she were a miracle. "Sophie? How?" "My lawyers said." "Forget the lawyers," she said, pulling back to look him in the eye. Her dove-gray dress was torn at the hem, her hair a wild halo, but she had never looked more like a queen. "My father is bankrupt, Julian. The merger isn't an expansion, it's a life raft. He's been embezzling from the Sterling Trust to pay for Isabella's lifestyle. I have the dates. I have the account numbers. I've seen them every time he made me organize his files because I was the only one he trusted not to care." Julian's eyes ignited with a sudden, fierce hope. "If we go to the Sterlings with this, the restraining order won't matter. Your father will be too busy fighting a felony charge to worry about us." "But it's more than that," Sophie said, her hand finding his. "I don't want to just stop him. I want to help you finish what you started. Your mother's foundation, it needs an artist's eye. It needs someone who sees the movement, not just the wood." In that moment, the power dynamic shifted forever. Julian didn't see a girl to be protected. He saw a partner. He saw the key to his own freedom. "Let's burn their stage play to the ground, Sophie," Julian whispered, a predatory smile finally returning to his face. Together. The turning point wasn't just escaping a room. It was Sophie realizing that the simple girl was the most powerful person in the city. They weren't hiding anymore. They were going on the offensive. Sophie is a genius. She used her invisibility to gather the evidence that's going to take her father down. "I'm literally screaming." Who knew the quiet sister was a secret investigator? What do you think her father's face will look like when the truth comes out? Tell me in the comments. And don't go anywhere. The climactic resolution is next. The brunch at the Bennett estate was supposed to be a victory lap. The sun beat down on the white linen tables and the silver platters of smoked salmon, but the air felt like the pressurized cabin of a plane about to crash. Robert Bennett sat at the head of the table, his chest puffed out, already rehearsing the speech that would announce the strategic partnership with Vane Capital. Isabella sat beside him, her eyes red-rimmed but her chin high, her wedding ring catching the light like a trophy. "Where is she?" Robert barked at the head steward. "Bring Sophie down. She needs to be seated before Julian arrives. I want a united front." "There's no need to bring her down, Robert," a voice rang out from the arched stone entryway. The guests turned. Julian Vane stepped onto the patio, but he wasn't alone. Sophie stood at his side, her hand tucked firmly into the crook of his arm. She wasn't wearing the gray dress anymore. She wore a tailored suit of charcoal wool, sharp, modern, and undeniably commanding. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek, professional knot, and her eyes held a clarity that made her father flinch. "Sophie, you ungrateful." Robert started to rise, his face purpling. "Mr. Vane, I believe we have a legal matter to discuss regarding your presence here." "Actually, Robert," Julian said, his voice a cool, terrifying calm that silenced the entire patio. "We have a mathematical matter to discuss. Specifically, the $42 million currently missing from the Sterling Trust, the trust you were supposed to be managing for your son-in-law." The color drained from Robert's face so fast it was as if a plug had been pulled. I don't know what you're talking about. That's slander. It's not slander when you have the receipts, Sophie said, stepping forward. She pulled a tablet from her bag and tapped the screen, projecting a series of bank transfers onto the large outdoor media screen usually reserved for Isabella's childhood slideshows. These are the offshore accounts, Dad. The ones you thought I was too simple to understand while I was filing your confidential correspondence. You didn't just spend the family money, you stole the Sterling's future to pay for this performance. A collective gasp rippled through the gathered elite. Isabella's new husband, the Sterling heir, stood up, his face a mask of dawning horror. Is this true? He whispered, looking at the screen. It's a lie. She's deluded. Isabella shrieked, pointing at Sophie. She's just jealous because she's nothing. She's just the shadow. The shadow is where the truth grows, Isabella, Sophie said, her voice steady and devoid of malice. I've spent 24 years watching you. I've seen every lie, every hidden bill, and every ounce of rot behind this gold leaf. I'm not the girl you can hide anymore. I'm the one turning the lights on. Julian stepped to her side, his hand resting protectively on the small of her back. The police are at the front gate, Robert. And the Sterling's lawyers are right behind them. You have 10 minutes to decide if you want to walk out of here in handcuffs or if you want to sign the confession Sophie has prepared. The climax was swift and brutal. The Ice King and the insignificant sister had executed a perfect pincer movement. Robert Bennett, faced with the cold, hard evidence of his own daughter's brilliance, collapsed into his chair, a broken man. The wedding of the century had become the trial of the decade. As the sirens began to wail in the distance, Julian turned to Sophie. He didn't look at the chaos or the falling empire. He looked at her with a reverence that made the morning sun seem dim. You did it, he whispered. No, she replied, her hand finding his. We did it. The most surprising twist wasn't the arrest or the scandal. It was the way the crowd, for the first time in history, didn't look at the bride. They looked at Sophie Bennett, the woman who had been the strongest person in the room all along. Sophie took the throne. She didn't just save herself. She saved the Sterling family from her father's greed. I have never seen a more satisfying takedown in my life. The shadow just became the sun. What did you think of that reveal? Did you see the Sterling Trust connection coming? Let me know in the comments. We have one part left, the satisfying conclusion. The dust from the Bennett scandal didn't just settle. It was swept away by a new, refreshing wind. 3 months later, the headlines were no longer about hostile takeovers or stolen trust funds. Instead, they spoke of the Vane Montgomery Foundation for Botanical Arts, a sanctuary of glass and greenery that had risen from the ruins of Julian's old corporate empire. Inside the foundation's private gallery, the air was cool and smelled of cedar and expensive paper. Sophie stood before the center exhibit, a series of massive, intricate charcoal drawings of the very plants she had once sketched in the dark. She wasn't wearing gray anymore. She wore a deep, vibrant forest green that made her eyes spark with a life that had been suppressed for far too long. They're calling you the discovery of the decade, Sophie, a deep, familiar voice murmured behind her. She turned to see Julian, his face relaxed in a way the Ice King had never been. He looked at her with a quiet, steady pride that was more valuable than any diamond. He didn't see the sensible daughter or the invisible sister. He saw his partner, his equal, and the woman who had saved his soul from the cold. I'm just the girl who saw the movement in the wood, Julian, she said, her hand finding his. You're the one who gave me the light to see it by. We gave it to each other, he corrected, pulling her close. The rest of the family had scattered like dry leaves in a storm. Robert was serving his sentence, finally forced to face the reality of his own hollow life. Isabella had retreated to a quiet life in the countryside, her wedding ring sold to pay for her own mounting debts. A hard but necessary lesson in the value of things that can't be bought. The performance was over, and for the first time the truth was enough. As the sun began to set, casting long golden fingers through the gallery windows, Julian led Sophie toward the terrace. Below them the city hummed, but it felt distant, a world away from the peace they had built. My mother would have loved this place, Julian whispered, looking out at the gardens. She would have loved you. I think she's the one who sent me to that wedding, Julian, Sophie replied, leaning her head on his shoulder. To make sure neither of us had to be alone in the dark anymore. He leaned down, his kiss full of the promise of 1,000 sunrises. The insecurities were gone, the family tensions were resolved, and the simple girl had finally found a world that was big enough for her heart. The shadows were gone. There was only the light, the art, and a love that had been seen when no one else was looking. And that is our story. Sophie Bennett didn't just find a prince. She found her own power and a man who was brave enough to stand beside it. I am so moved by her journey from the sidelines to the center of her own life. What was your favorite part of Sophie and Julian's journey? Did you love the greenhouse scenes as much as I did? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this emotional 40-minute story, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. We have so many more addictive, heart-pounding stories coming your way. Thank you for being part of our storytelling family, and I'll see you in the next one.